Yep. So thank you very much, Paco, for accepting our invitation to give us, let's say, a more extended introduction into plant intelligence, or maybe how plants move and think, or how they move, think. Yeah, and you have the digital online floor.
Okay, Alexandra, thank you so much. So let me just share my screen and compartir pantalla. Okay. Yeah, so can you now see the screen? Full screen?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, okay, so yeah, basically, let me just use, let me see if I can use the, no, hold on. Oh, yeah, there you go. Now we have the laser pointer. I found out only last week ago or something like that. Somebody told me, you just press Command L and then you have the laser pointer. I didn't know that.
Nice, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks, Alexandra. So you mentioned two things like movement and thinking. So let's see what we can find out about the way plants move and whether they can think at all, or whether there is something we can call or deserves the label plant intelligence, right? And actually, that's great, because the way you phrased it, because those are two sides of the same coin, right? So when we talk about thoughts or thinking, and when we talk about movement, right? So this now that I see the subtitle here, like the describing in movement, observing through embodiment. So that's sort of the topic of this general event. And I just thought it was just perfect, right, to talk about intelligence in terms of movement and in terms of embodiment, right? So if you want to get like the bigger picture, we may say, or the way I thought of this title is that I thought we could provide some way of enacting some sort of bridge in between the plant sciences and the arts. Mm-hmm. So I take it that most of the people there in the audience will be artists or related to arts more than the plant sciences themselves, right? And I think it's important to say that I'm myself neither an artist nor a plant scientist. I'm a philosopher of plant science, right? So we have a lab, the Minimal Intelligence Lab. Here you can see it at the philosophy department in the University of Murcia in Spain. And we perform both theoretical, conceptual, and empirical work related to plants. So we are trying to understand what is it, this thing we call plant intelligence, and how much we are able to unearth with different tools, right? So maybe if we think of movement, I think is the right way to try to make some headway into the way to bridge in between these two fields, right? So just think, I just took this picture like a couple of days ago. I saw it browsing the internet. It was the winner, Sergei Gorshov's picture, the winner of the Wildlife Photography of the Year 2020. I like to use these wildlife pics when I give talks. I usually had ones from a few years ago. And it doesn't matter if it's from 2018, 2019, 2020, it's always the same problem, right? And the problem is that you guys pay attention to this guy here. So this is the guy doing something that deserves the label cognitive, intelligent, or whatever, right? Or sentience. We could even talk about plant sentience or plant consciousness, not just about plant intelligence or plant cognition. So that also depends on how much time, by the way, we have. We'll see that. We'll see how that goes. But I have some extra slides in case you're interested to hear about those other more thorny issues like sentience and in the tree of life and consciousness and all these other issues, like whether plants do in fact have some sort of subjective awareness, right? So here, if we are willing, at least in principle, to apply those expressions to someone in the picture, it could be to the cat, right? We would say that, oh, okay, it's the guy doing something, is processing information, it has some intentions, it might have desires. Of course, it's not going to express them verbally. That's only in the case of human beings with linguistic competencies. But the rest of animals, we are cool with them, right? So it's a shame. So it's such a pity that we are missing everything else in this picture, right? Mm-hmm. So there's all these guys here. All these guys here are doing amazing things. And in fact, one thing I love about this picture is that it's not even a man-made, human-made forest. So it's not with all the trees lined up. No, it's all really wild stuff, right? So they are all, that means that they are all having to, to fight, to find their way out and do photosynthesis through the canopy. They have to do things to survive, to pass their genes. So it's not simply them being there and that's it. And yet, it feels like this is just the background, and we only the guy here catches our eye, right? This is the same thing that happens if you are home now, locked down with COVID, and for some reason, again, only the lady here at the desk and the cat grabs our attention. So if there is anything worth calling intentional or some notion of agency, is something that we ascribe to animals. So there is an agent here, that's pretty clear to us. If you have a pet, Alexandra or anyone else, you have a dog or a cat or whatever, you all know that they are agents in your heart of hearts. Then a different issue is what sort of scientific evidence we can use to back this claim up. But it's pretty obvious to us that in a sense, we know what we are talking about. There is some sort of intelligence there. Then we might discuss how much intelligence, how it differs from our own intelligence. All that are different issues, but there is no question that this cat is not different from, matter. There is something there, right? But what happens with this little cacti on the table and this potted plant? We don't really pay attention to them. So it's not a matter of wildlife or a domestic scenario. So I mean, we tend to look at this like, like the lamp, like the notebook, whatever is on the table, the laptop. It's just part of the furniture. It's part of the background. It's not really something that we are willing to investigate with the tools of the cognitive sciences, right? So, and the reason for this goes back, in fact, it really goes back to Descartes or to the way, this is called the Cartesian theater. And it's a little bit the sort of intuition or the intuition pump underneath this idea of providing a demarcation line in between the living and the living plus intelligent, like the cat and the lady, as opposed to the potted plant or the desk, right? And it's that in a sense, we cannot help but think of intelligence as something that has to do with the way we manipulate and we handle information in our head. So representations, symbols, all these linguistic labels in our case, or non-linguistic labels in the case of non-human animals, but still we are somehow following rules, doing things with these bits of information as if we were following a cooking recipe. And we have the ingredients and we end up having a full dish that we serve on the plate. But this is the very problem, that because we have such a wrong understanding of what intelligence is about, even in the case of human and non-human animals, then we say, hey, I cannot picture what it could be like for a plant to have this little guy in the plant's head, right? To get started with, I mean, where could the plant head possibly be? So we have a clear understanding of where is the cat's head and the human guy's head. And okay, whatever is going on inside their heads. And then we can talk about all these computational and representational resources that allow us to understand the behavior that we observe in terms of intelligence, right? And then we can make predictions, and then we can say, oh, I thought, Alexandra was putting on her jacket because she believed it was cold, and then she felt like, okay, she thought that by putting the jacket on, she would, and then we resort to all this mental machinery, right? Some philosophers call this mental gymnastics, right? Mm-hmm. So we perform a lot of mental gymnastics, and then we think, what sort of mental gymnastics could a plant perform? Makes no sense, right? But remember, we were talking about, hey, what happens if we get started with movement and not with this cartoon version of intelligence, right? So the problem with movement is that, this is a fellow philosopher, Patricia Churchland, retired now from UCSD in California, San Diego. And I hate to do this, but I always use her quote because I think there's nothing special about her. I mean, many other philosophers and cognitive scientists get it wrong too. But I think the way he phrased it, it really pinpoints to what's actually wrong in this approach, right? So Patricia, in this case, is saying that if you root yourself in the ground, like a plant, if you're a plant, you can afford to be stupid, right? But we know, we animals, you know, like the wild cat, tree hugging, or the cat next to the lady on the desk, those guys are in the moving business, okay? They're, you know, in all these games of predator-prey relations. So, you know, that's why they evolved a central nervous system, right? Because they need to respond fast, things are happening, and then you cannot afford to, you know, you cannot afford to do like a plant that is simply rooted and take lives as it comes, right? So, okay, let's put it this way. If it was like that, if it was truly like that, I would agree that plants are stupid. But plants are not simply rooted, taking life as it comes. They are doing a lot of things. We're going to see a lot of time-lapse footages, well, not a lot, but a few, but enough to illustrate the idea that there is something that we are missing. It has nothing to do with the plant in themselves. It has to do with our attitude, with the way we try to throw light upon what is it that they are doing. Of course, if you walk by real fast, you think it's there, just rooted. But what happens if you slow down, right? So is there a cure for plant blindness? So in a sense, we are plant blind. We don't appreciate what they are doing. They are simply furniture. They are part of the background. But simply doing something like this allows us to, you know, to think about it twice, to say, hey, are they truly, this is little footage from David Attenborough.
It waves its shoots agitatedly from side to side, as if feeling for the best way forward. And when a shoot settles on its course, it thrusts ahead, relentless. Stems, backward pointing spines give it the grip it needs to climb over almost anything that stands in its way. It can advance as much as 3 inches in a day. Before long, the shoot will put down rootlets, and then new territory will have been annexed for the bramble empire.
Okay, did you see that? We would need to watch it a few times to pay attention to every single expression David Attenborough was using. But just pick the last one. He said they can advance up to 3 inches per day. I mean, 3 inches per day is a lot, a lot. So what does it mean to say they are simply rooted and they can afford to be stupid? They are on the move. They move at the speed that they need to secure what's important to them. So we cannot use our scale, our time scale as the benchmark. We need to put the context of what's relevant to the organism in question that we are trying to study. I mean, take sponges. Sponges are animals and they are pretty much rooted, I would say, way more than plants, as you can tell from David Attenborough's documentary, right? So simply by saying that, hey, plants move, that's not the end of the story. That's actually just the very beginning. So it's not about moving and that's it. So we need to understand what's important about movement. What is it about movement and embodiment that brings intelligence, right? So the more important thing to do, or the more challenging thing to do, intellectually speaking, for us human beings as observers, is to try truly to put ourselves in their shoes, to understand what's important to them, right? So they don't care about this. This is the target of their portrait, right? So that's very important, not simply because of the target itself, but because by understanding their needs, we have a way to understand what sort of time scale is meaningful to them and is meaningful for us, for example, to make an experimental design and check whether they are moving fast or slow. Is 3 inches per day fast or slow? Well, depends on what you need to do, right? So it's all in the eye of the beholder and in the eye of the observer, right? So we need to try to put ourselves in their shoes, and this is not metaphorical, this is truly literally. So we need to understand what matters to them, what's meaningful to them, what their intentions are, right? In fact, when you think of what matters to them, it's not big surprise to see that all these vectors are informationally speaking valuable. So they care about all this, of course, about potential pollinators, about stress, hydric stress, about any sort of potential harmful conditions that may come from their local environment, right? So that's all information that is actually valuable, and they need to pay attention to it all. In fact, here this is just a tiny list of things that matter to plants, right? So if you think that they care about light, temperature, mechanical stimulation, vibrations, water deficit, the gravity pull, of course, you know, many, you can see the list, the full list of them. So we can start to understand that they are not simply there being rooted, affording to be stupid and simply doing photosynthesis. No, to be able to do photosynthesis, they need to do a lot of things. And now that you think about it, it's a great way to go back and think of that wild forest in the background of the big cat. All these vectors, all these channels of information are impinging upon the sensory surfaces of the trees in the forest, and they need to behave flexibly, adaptively, to deal with circumstances that have to do with all those patterns of information, right? So one first thing that is critical to avoid this cartoon understanding of plant intelligence and plant behavior is that for plant behavior to be truly flexible and adaptive, you cannot simply be thinking of responding to one source of stimulation. So it's not like the plant is responding to gravity and then the roots grow downwards or the shoots grow upwards, or they are responding to light and then they are behaving phototropically, bending towards the light source, or things like that. No, that's again falling prey of this cartoon interpretation, or this cartoon version of what it's intelligence or behavior about. They need to integrate all that information. So they need some way to integrate it all and provide a response that is globally adaptive. So I cannot simply respond to gravity or to light or to an insect trying to munch on me or to a pollinator. I need to have a global understanding of all these positive and negative sources of feedback, such that I provide a response that, hey, I'm here, I'm doing well, right? If they were going back to this quote, if they were simply being rooted, taking life as it comes, they would have gone extinct many years ago, and yet they are here passing their genes, right? So that simply means that there is something we are doing that is really wrong, and we have to make the mental effort to understand what is it that is wrong and what can we make to change that attitude, right? And this is funny, because this is something that starts way back. I mean, it's not that nowadays, you'll see in a few slides some recent footage, but this is not something that wasn't being done in those days. I mean, this time lapse goes back to the origins of cinema. This was shot 3 months after the first ever recorded cinematographic projection in France, right? This is amazing. I love this film. This is the smodin, the telegraph plant, and this is mimosa. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you now about mimosa. Right. So some other plants, we can also time-lapse the roots and see how they are behaving. This is very important. You'll see why when we talk about embodiment in the roots. You see plants responding to gravity. You fill the pot and then it recovers, straightening up, shooting upwards. So a negative geotropism against the gravity pull, right? For the shoots would be the other way around, right? So this is important because we might think that not having the technological means to record, to observe plant behavior is what underlies plant blindness. So great, now we have these cameras, now we have great equipment. Think of BBC documentaries or think of the stuff you do in high-tech labs. Okay, it's not rocket science, but still you have amazing equipment and then you can shoot real close-ups and with a lot of detail and you can appreciate things. But that's not the problem. That's if we think that that's the way to go forward, we are missing something more important because the attitude is already there. I mean, Darwin already was able to do that. This is Darwin's observing plants to the naked eye. So it has nothing to do with technology. You can do it to the naked eye. So Darwin was doing this. He was just placing just a mark on the plant and then just a background point of reference. And then by aligning them both, he was able to draw on the glass plate the point aligned, right? And then waiting a few minutes or hours, then the next point, and waiting a few minutes. So a lot of patience, but you could still appreciate plant movement and plants' adaptive responses, right? This is actually a nicer picture. So here you can actually see how a climbing plant is revolving around to get hold of a support, because the support, the pole, is meaningful to the plant. So that's what matters. We have to put ourselves in their shoes. Hey, what is it that matters to you? Oh, if I'm a climbing plant, I need the host tree, I need the pole, I need the support. So definitely that's something we all need, right? So you can see the effort that Darwin was making to be able to appreciate that pattern of movement. Again, it's all about movement, right? So if plants were truly still, were really still, I would agree. They couldn't be intelligent. But we need to say, hey, are we missing something? Well, you can even see to the naked eye, right? And this is some of the plates he was able to draw in some of his books. So you can see the trajectory. So this is just the trajectory of a single plant, right? After a few hours or days, right? So he was able to use these glass plates and keep marking the dots, and keep track of the trajectory. And some of those trajectories could be really cumbersome. So it wasn't simply, it could be zigzagging, trying to get hold of something. So then that way you can start to understand, hey, what is it that matters to the plant? I'm going to try to put myself in the plant's shoes, right? So this allows you to do so. And then you can move from such preliminary or primitive, not primitive, but not sophisticated techniques to today's best time-lapse equipment. So this is just a video where you can see. This is amazing. You see when you stimulate the flower, you will see that the pollen is hidden here in the folded petals. So it's being protected by the petals, right? So the stamen itself, when it feels the stimulation, the mechanical stimulation of a pollinator, buzzing around, is, hey, the right time to bring the pollen to the fore, okay? So I'll do it kind of faster so that you can see it. You see? You see it's moving now? Now it came out of the, you see it coming here? Okay. So this is something that take place, or in this case, took place in a couple of minutes. So that something that if you are patient enough, you watch it to the naked eye. So you just sit for 2 minutes and see how the stamen is being let free out of the petal and going to the center position. Now it's in the bullseye for the pollinator, right? So A different issue is how much of that behavior deserves the label intelligent. I mean, if it's just a mere adaptation, that's the end of the story. So, of course, there are a lot of smart adaptations, but we don't say that the individual, the organism is smart. We just say that it has good genes. It was a good adaptation that pays off, and that's why they pass their genes, right? So it's not just a matter of having a good adaptation. It's a matter of behaving flexibly enough in a way which is anticipatory and depends on the history of the individual, right? What matters to the individual as such, not simply what got in its genes, right? And here we can see, this is important in terms of thinking of how interaction with the surroundings can enhance the pattern of movement that we are after. So here we are placing, this is from a colleague, František, we do it here as well. What we do is we place this is maize roots, seedlings, and the primary root, just being born, we place it on a slope, right? We place it on a slope such that it has to make an effort to keep digging to grow downwards because of the gravitational pull. So the roots grow downwards following the vector of gravity, and yet we have placed them upwards with a slight inclination on the slope. So they need to make, they are trying to counteract that direction of growth, and we can enhance what's like a earthworm-like pattern of movement, right? You can see, right? There is a lot to be said about what's happening at the root tip here to understand why that pattern of behavior is taking place, but we can skip that for now, right? So, of course, we know that that there is, if you go to the physiology and to the signaling processes involved, we know it's just a matter of sedimentation, right? So at the root tip, we have these organelles that would sediment. So by sedimenting, they are providing the cue as to what is south and what is north, what is downwards, what is upwards. So this is like the glass of milk, and you shake the cocoa grains, and then you let the glass of milk, you lay it on the table, and the grains sediment. So this is just the organelles sedimenting. So that's why when you place the plant, when you tilt it and place it on one side, that sedimentation is moving to the other side of the cell, and that's triggering all the signaling mechanisms involved in recovering from to the normal position, right? So we know those things are happening. We know those things are happening, and we might overinterpret results and think, hey, you see how smart they are? And you might say, no, look, I mean, just pure plant physiology tells you how they do it. It's nothing other than, the blind result of these sediments laying down at the bottom of the cell. So no big deal about it. It's great. It's a great mechanism, but why call it intelligent, right? So I would agree with that if it was simply a matter of understanding how they behave geotropically. But remember, we were talking about the need to integrate all incoming signals. So they have to provide the global response, not just to gravity, right? So that's why it matters, because the plant needs to say, hey, watch, it's not just gravity telling me, it's not the sediments, the organelles sedimenting downwards and telling me, hey, this is the way to grow my roots, this is the way to grow my shoots, but because there is also this pollinator buzzing around, and then there is light, and then there is hydric stress because nobody watered me for the last few weeks, and blah, blah. All these things is that you need to make sense of. And that's a whole different business, right? That when it comes into play the experience and the history of past experiences of the individual as such. Hey, I know this means this because last week I was also exposed to this. I will pay more attention or I will skip it, right? And that's what happens, for example, in some patterns of very primitive learning. So some very primitive forms of learning, such as habituation, we know how they work, right? I mean, in animal species, you just say, hey, I can be, prodding, I can just poking with my finger into the guy's sensory system. And then after a while, it says, oh, yeah, I know you, it's just Paco, you know, messing around with me, but it's not really, you know, it's a nice chap, you know, no big deal. Then they stop retracting their tentacles or whatever. So they get habituated. So habituation is the most primitive form of learning, but we know it also happens in plants. And what's critical is that this form of learning, however primitive it is, relates not just to the gene side of the story, but to the previous history of the subject. What happened to me a few minutes ago? Oh, I picked the rule. It's Paco poking me, right? So that happens to Mimosa. Remember Mimosica? We saw the time lapse from a century ago. Well, this is Monica Galeanos, a colleague of mine. Her research is truly amazing. She's done some really interesting stuff in learning, both habituation and associative learning. You'll see later. But in habituation, this is the same thing that happens here. Happens to an anemone. It happens to a mimosa plant. So what Monica did, she was just dropping the mimosa plant from a height of 15 centimeters. And after a while, the plant just said, okay, you know, I won't fold my leaves anymore. So mimosa, the sensitive plant, they fold their leaves when they feel this threat. And then you see here, it's folded. So as they fold, then they unfold them back again once the danger is over. But after a while, Mimosa said, hey, I don't need to fold them anymore. It's just Monica poking me, right? Or dropping me from a height, right? So of course, there were some controls to exclude the possibility that the plant was simply exhausted. And you might say, hey, maybe it didn't fold anymore because it was already exhausted. That was controlled for and everything. So we have a good reason to think that we are not simply talking about adaptations. This is learning, right? But for some reason, when it's a plant, the subject that is performing this competency, learning, we take it like, oh, that cannot be possible. A plant learning, I mean, that's kind of tricky. They don't even have neurons. I mean, how could they learn? They don't even have neurons. So we cannot make sense of this, right? Imagine if we cannot make sense of habituation, imagine what happens with associative learning. So if for anyone who is not familiar with the term, just think of Pavlov's dog, right? So this was the classical example of Pavlov with associating the possibility of triggering a conditioned response, right? So if you show the food to the dog would go mad. Oh, food. If you show something which is neutral, some neutral stimulus, the dog wouldn't pick any meaning. Oh, this means nothing to me. So they would just stay quiet. But then if you present one after the other, after a while, they pick the association. So, oh, after the bell comes the food. After the bell comes the food. After the bell comes the food. Oh, just by hearing the bell, they say, hey, the food comes next, right? So they are able in these smart experimental settings to trigger a conditioned response, right? And this is something else, because remember what we said before about the cartoon interpretation of intelligence, like the little guy in your head. This is the mistake that we may say, hey, there is a little guy in the head saying, oh, a bell, now comes the food. Okay, of course, this is just a metaphorical way of speaking. And if you don't take it too seriously and just think physiologically speaking of what's happening there, then you might say, why couldn't we test the same very possibility in organisms other than animals, in the tree of life, in other kingdoms, right? So that's again what Monica did with these experiments with pea plants. And you know, the pea plants' food in this case was a light, blue light, which is food to plants, right? The blue light is triggering the phototropic response, so they go towards the light to do photosynthesis. And then if you just flow, you know, play some fan to provide an airflow, they couldn't do anything, like, you know, like the dog listening to the bell without connecting it to the food, of course. But once you associate both, oh, after the fan comes the food, they end up bending towards the fan, expecting that the food will come next, right? So this is pretty impressive, and it's in fact it's so recent. It just came out 4 years ago that it hasn't been replicated yet, There is some contrary evidence, so some other labs have tried to replicate it, they haven't managed to. So the jury is still out, we might say, right? So I don't want to present this as conclusive evidence. Actually, in our own lab, we are trying to replicate it, and we haven't done it yet. So we are, because we want to understand what's happening here, right? So we are time-lapsing plans as they are trying to, as we are hoping they might show some evidence of more sophisticated forms of learning. But whichever, this is the important point, whichever the outcome is, positive or negative, so regardless of whether we are able to find positive evidence of associative learning or not, the take-home message is that nothing prevents us from studying the phenomenon insofar as having neurons shouldn't be understood as a prerequisite on learning. So if you learn in a more or less sophisticated fashion, it will have to do with the type of pressures that you have in your ecological environment. So what matters to you, what threats are around there, and what you are able to do to counter those and to keep passing your genes. So if they are not able to perform associative learning, in the end, if that's what we find out, that's okay. There is no problem about it. The one and only problem is that we preemptively, so we are so prejudicial that we don't even try, because we assume that because you are a plant and you don't have neurons, you by default, by definition, couldn't possibly learn, right? That's what's a mistake, right? And that has to do, Alexandra, with what about, we'll talk about that later, but about the very possibility of informing or getting inspiration from the arts and from other fields to do this type of experimental designs, right? What we can try to learn from each other to think of different working hypotheses. So so let's leave it there for the time being, right? So basically what we are saying here is that the one and only problem is to think of the type of systems that we find in animals and the type of systems that we find in parallel in plants as exclusively from a physiological perspective, right? As if physiology was all to it, right? You can see the parallelisms are clear in between different systems, but when we think of the vascular system of a plant, this is the mistake. We think of the vascular system of a plant as the way to pass the bucket, to pass nutrients and water throughout the plant body. Oh, I need food, I need sugars from photosynthesis, I need water from the soil. So the translocation of all these goods up and down the plant body is what we think the vascular system is for. And of course, it is for that, but not exclusively. So from a physiological perspective, we can make sense of those pathways as the motorways, or the motorways that these trucks use to carry the goods from one side to the other, right? But the critical issue here from a cognitive science perspective, so to apply or to try to understand how could a plant possibly learn despite not having a central nervous system, is to think of those systems, in this case the vascular system, as an information processing system, right? So it's in the business of processing information. It's not simply translocating sugars and water and minerals. So it's information, the currency, what matters to the plant. Because remember, we were talking about, hey, we need to integrate all those informational channels. So the only way a plant can do that is through a vast network of connections. And that's what we find when we look at a plant. In fact, this is the vascular system of the main stem of a papaya tree. This picture is from 1926. And check the book title, The Nervous Mechanism of Plants. Because here, what we've learned from Bose, we are talking almost 100 years ago, is that there is electrochemical flows of information. So the currency is the same that we find in animals. Remember, in the animals, we said, hey, we need the central nervous system to, to trigger responses fast, real fast. We are on the move. We need to be alert, prey, preys. So predator-prey relations. And in plants, we said, hey, the time scale is different. We need to do something else. It's true that the time scale is different, but the currency need not be different. And we find that the vascular system provides the functional equivalent to the nervous system in animals. So it's the way to pass messages along electrochemically, right? So this is the big difference, that we have a default understanding of plants as being stupid because they are rooted, they don't move. Now we know that they do, and because they don't have neurons. And what we find is that what matters is not to be neuronal or non-neuronal, it's to be excitable or non-excitable. You can have excitable tissue. It doesn't need to be neuronal. So what matters is that they fire. And we know they fire. Think of a Venus flytrap. Just think of a carnivorous plant. Of course they fire. You touch the inner hair and they fire. They fire an action potential like a neuron does. It's simply not a neuron. But still, the mechanisms, if you go to the electrophysiology, the electrophysiological mechanisms are pretty much preserved across evolution, across the tree of life. So it is the very same thing. But because we have this anthropocentric attitude or animal-centric attitude, we say, hey, if you are doing smart things, you need to have neurons and you need to talk to each other in a real fast way. Now, fast or slow depends on what you need. And having neurons or not is not what's at stake. It's the fact that you can convey the messages. And they are able to convey those messages by exploiting this vast vascular architecture that extends throughout the whole plant body from root to shoot, okay? So you see, now we are not talking about the basic physiology, we are talking about a huge information processing network. Now think of the picture in the wildlife photograph competition. Now you look at the trees in that forest with a different eye. If you think of this vascular system serving to pass all these messages from root to shoot, oh, now it's not that different from the big cat. They are both exchanging a lot of information round the clock, 24/7, because it matters to them. Different speeds, different intentions, different meaningful interactions with their surroundings, but it's theirs, not yours, what they care about, right? See what I mean? So that's basically the idea. Now, this is the problem we have, and this is one of the reasons we need to go for movement, because we have an understanding of intelligence in which we have forgotten about movement altogether. We think of intelligence like in the abstract, like, okay, yeah, it's like playing a game of chess, right? Oh, thinking is like, if plants think, you somehow think that they've got to be doing something similar to what you do, right? And that's the very mistake, to think that they need to care about what you care about. No, forget about yourself. Now you might think, okay, if it's not about playing chess or about thinking abstract thoughts the way we do, or we think we do, then we can have a different understanding of what movement means, right? Because if we think, so what I granted, that's a good cartoon. So what I granted before was that if plants didn't move, I could acknowledge that they are stupid. Now we need to understand what we mean by movement. Movement is not your type of movement. They don't need to move the way you do. In their case, movement is growth. In their case, movement is development. So if you think of growth and development, and we can, by the way, inspire ourselves in our creations with their type of movement, you may think of yourself as growing, as developing, and try to see what the world would look like from that perspective. Not by locomoting, but by stretching, right? That has a lot of implications. So that's the type of thing we try to unearth or throw some light upon at the Minimal Intelligence Lab, right? So this is some of the gadgets that we use. And we combine the type of time-lapse observations with electrophysiological recordings. So think of this combined approach. Okay, let's see what the plant is doing. Remember, movement means growth and development and not locomotion. And we want to know what's happening within the vascular system of the plant. So we want to equate or see the correlations in between the overt behavior that we are able to observe to the naked eye or through time-lapse footage with the electrophysiological activity, the electrochemical flows of information spanning throughout the whole vascular system of the plant from root to shoot. Now we can start to get a picture of what matters to them. Hey, let's see what fires and where and how fast or how much it grows and in which direction in relation to this type of stimuli I'm presenting to the plant, right? So that's a little bit of the game we play here, right? So that's some of the things we call this phytoacupuncture because we insert acupuncture needles. So the acupuncture needles are the electrodes. We send them to the amplifier and register the signal. So we can see what's happening as the plant performs some activity. Remember, this is a climbing plant. Remember what we said, they care about the support, right? We might think, hey, let's see how it's trying to approach the support and let's see what's going on within the plant, those flows of information, right? So this is the type of cabinets that we use, the booths that we use to time lapse these climbing plants as they, so this would be like the sketch of what we do. So we have like a top camera and you can take a central picture. So we can remember of Darwin's naked eye observations. So we can check the trajectory, right? So, so if you do that, oh, yeah. So this is the type of picture that you end up having, right? You can see the pattern of motion. Now we are talking about a pattern of motion, growth and development. So because think that to do this, to reach the pole, it has to combine both. So it's not just the growth, but it's target-oriented growth. So it's growth and development towards a target, right? And if you add to this the need to behave proactively, so not reactively, not like, okay, I touch you and then I respond in turn, but proactively. And that's very important in nature, because sometimes if you don't behave proactively, if you don't behave anticipatorily, then you are dead meat. You don't have the time to do what you need to do, right? So in plants, it's even more important to behave anticipatorily and proactively because of their time scale. Their time scale is so slow that if they don't make sure they know what they are doing, that's it, end of the story. They don't have a second chance because they are not fast or exploit the type of movement that we exploit that would allow us to have a silver bullet or to try twice or to try 3 times. Then it's, hey, you missed the target, okay, that's it. You don't flower, you don't pass your genes, right? So now I'll show you some time lapse. I think Alexandra already knows it, but other people won't. So, but before that, let me show you this. Had I shown you this before, Alexandra?
No, actually, no.
Okay, so check it out. This is good. Now they are happy. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, shit. Okay, so basically, you get the idea, right? The idea is there is a huge risk that we are anthropomorphizing our observations. So it's so easy. In fact, it's so difficult not to do it. I mean, can you really, if we played it twice and 3 times and 4 times, I bet no one would be able to simply watch the triangles and the squares or whatever it was, the round shape, just as geometric shapes. It's so difficult not to inflate it, right? And that's a real risk, because by overinterpreting plant time lapses, we might be shooting ourselves in the foot. We might be anthropomorphizing their patterns of growth and development. Okay, so that's why it's so important to say, hey, take it easy. Let's try to understand what's happening here, because we might be treating plants as triangles and squares, that we inflate intentionality into them, and it's not real. It's not part of their mechanism. It's part of your, overexcited approach, right? So this is you've seen this. Let everyone else watch it, and then we can comment it. Well, but maybe let me just say that just forget about the lateral picture. You want to watch here to the top picture, right? So this is the climbing bean that we mentioned before, and it's circumnutating. It's growing and developing anti-clockwise, right? You can see it's doing like 360 degrees. Now up to a point, we cut it short, it's longer the time lapse, but just to get to the point, up to a point you will see that it will skip half of the trajectory and just go for it, fish for the pole, right? So just, you see it's still doing the 360 degrees. Now you will see what happens now. It will go to the back and zoom, fishing straight all the way from, see? So it's like skipping the second half and now goes back again. So it's like really counterbalancing, zoom. Okay, one more try. It's trying hard, okay, and gets it, right? So remember, I said, it's trying hard. It's so difficult just to keep it apart. So the way of speaking, of course, I don't mean to say it's trying hard. That's a way of speaking. But that doesn't mean that the behavior of the plant is not intelligent, that is not anticipatory and goal-directed and target-oriented, right? So that's what we are testing at the moment. That's what we want to find out. That's what I mean by being extra careful not to shoot ourselves in the foot and say, hey, we might be overinterpreting this and thinking there is more than there truly is, right? But think about it. If you have a target and you need to reach for it, you'd better anticipate throughout this way of communicating or passing along messages, electrochemically speaking, through the vascular system, how you want to grow, in which direction. You cannot wait to bump onto the pole. In fact, it didn't bump onto the pole. So it's not reactive, as in, oh, I bumped onto it, oh, now I twine around. No, it's not I bump onto it and then I twine around. It's that before there is any contact, any physical contact, the plant is organizing, controlling the pattern of growth such that it grows in the right direction to fetch it, to fish for it, right? So that's the working hypothesis, that's what's happening, that's what we need to unearth, right? So, but once you think of the vascular system in those information processing terms, and you think anticipatorily and in this other framework, and forget about these cartoon interpretations of the plant having a little plant in its head saying, oh, that's a pole, I need to go for it. So once you forget about those cartoons, which don't even apply in the case of human and non-human animals, then things don't look that bizarre. We just need to do science and do it right, to try to understand how it's going, right? Let me skip this one. So now comes now let's talk about movement, right? Okay, those are the phenomena that in principle are subject to this investigation. To say, think of associative learning. Remember the P-plant associative learning, what we are trying to replicate at the moment. Think of climbers orienting their growth towards targets. Any other plant you may think of, and any other pattern of behavior you are able to unearth through time-lapse footage or through naked eye observations. Once you have those in place, and without prejudging the question and without over-interpreting the data, then we need to think about what it means or how can we make sense of that behavior in terms of intelligence. What does it mean to perceive? Okay, so when you perceive, and forget about this cartoon version of having a little representation in your head, when you perceive, what is it that you are perceiving? Either you human subject or animal or plant or whatever. What is it that an organism, a living organism perceives, right? One way to put it is that what we perceive is nothing other than possibilities of interaction with the surroundings. So sometimes information is already out there, right? So I don't need a symbolic label. I don't need a little, stick onto the door to say pull or push. I don't need to read the symbol. Oh, push, I will push. Oh, pull, I will pull the handle. No, I just need the environment to provide the cues ecologically. And that means if I have a flat surface with no handle, I can do anything other than just push. There is no handle to pull. If I have a handle, it's more uncomfortable to push on this thing coming out. So it's easier to just pull. In nature, we have those designs provided by evolution. And we find that organisms are able to perceive those possibilities of interaction, right? Directly. So don't think of this representation in your head. Think that directly you see in the way you couple to the environment. You couple to the environment, embodiment, the coupling. So I'm not talking about the brain of the subject. I'm talking about the hand, the surface of the hand, and the size of the hand. And it's not about the size of the hand. It's about the size of the hand with respect to the size of the handle or the size of this flat plate. So it's only, so put it this other way. What if maybe we have been missing intelligence in plants and misinterpreting intelligence in animals because we were thinking that that was something that we had to find out here. Crack open the skull and see what's going on here. And the unit of analysis is not the organism. So we shouldn't be caring about the plant or the animal. It's not the organism what counts. It's the organism and environment. So it's the coupling of the two. So the hand itself makes no sense. The handle makes no sense. It's only the way this hand with this size couples to this handle. In fact, if it was a baby's hand, it wouldn't perceive that possibility of interaction. So the affordance is being perceived, is perceiving the affordance of pushing, right? That's what you perceive, providing your height, your strength, your hand surface, and many other things that you wouldn't perceive if you were some other organism, right? So that's what's happening with the perception of affordances, that they are scale dependent and dependent interaction. So depending on your body, on your plant body or your human body or your morphology, then you will perceive one or other interaction, one or other possibility of interaction. You will perceive different affordances depending on who you are. So if you are this guy here, you can perceive climbability or hideability. Oh, that's something where potentially I can hide if this guy comes for me. And he is perceiving, oh, a stone. That's something a mouse might hide behind. And this is the type of affordances I might perceive. Oh, something I can hit. Oh, something I can use as a hammer to nail something down. or something I can throw, that has to do with who you are. So put it this way, when we think of plant behavior and try to see intelligence in plant behavior, we need to think of the opportunities for behavioral interactions that the plant perceives as an organism in the very same way that you do as a human being, or you do as a cat, or you do as a mouse. So the plant is one another agent, is one more agent in these patterns of interactions, right? So this is what the plant is perceiving, not a pole, but climbability. So this is the mistake, to think of the stone as something I can represent in my head. So you don't have a picture of the stone in your head that you do something, you do things with. It's something that you directly interact with, right? So don't sit down and think, move, interact, right? So it's this loop of perception and action. By closing this loop of perceiving and acting is where you find meaning in the surroundings. Meaning is in the interaction itself, right? So the plant, so put it this way now, the plant wouldn't be able to say, hey, a pole there, okay? You don't say, there is a pole there, now I'm gonna plan how I get to approach it. No, you keep moving and moving and moving. And as you move, you perceive a possibility of interaction that depends on the way you move and on the scale of the organism and the environment. So the size of the plant, the distance to the pole, the rate of change, how it's moving, the speed, the acceleration, right? All those is providing ways to understand how you can interact with the surroundings. We are not talking about anything in the head. That's why the cartoon version doesn't apply. We are talking about how you interact in real time with your surroundings, right? So the plant is not perceiving, is not representing a pole and then computing the trajectory to the pole. It's perceiving climbability directly, right? Now, this is even more interesting because we've been talking up until now about a single subject. So this is the climbing being here, this is the pole, right? So let's see what I do when I reach the pole. But now you can think of complex social interactions in between members of the same community and members of different communities. I mean, this is the three sisters, right? The three sisters, they've been cropped for millennia. They find a benefit out of interacting with each other, right? So the maze provides the pole for the climber. So if you're a climbing being, you climb around the maze, right? So the maze provides the pole, right? The being is in its turn providing things to the soil. The squash, or I guess you don't call it here, well, the pumpkin or squash, whatever you call it, it's again doing something in its turn. It's providing the cover for the soil to prevent dehydration and biological contamination, right? So you have a symbiotic relation in between three plant species that recognize each other and perceive affordances, perceive possibility of interaction. So when you put these three guys together, you get a better yield. They do better. And that's not something you can explain mentalistically with these mental gymnastics we were referring to. This is something you explain by looking at the pattern of interaction in real time. And this applies, remember when we were looking at the maze roots, like making these worm-like movements, navigating the soul upwards on the slope? So if you think of the roots moving, they are doing the same as the climbing being. So if think of the climbing being was like doing like this, right? Until it was fishing for the pole. Just think of the roots below ground doing exactly the same. So the roots below ground, as they are moving, they are generating the same sort of information. They are targeting nutrient patches. They are targeting water pools. So they are targeting what matters to them, chemical gradients. So they target what's truly meaningful to them. And they will only find what's meaningful in the very same way that you find that the handle tells you to pull and not to push. As they move, they understand what sort of interaction is meaningful and what sort of interaction is not meaningful, right? So, so that's something we can apply both above and below ground, and both with a subject with respect to the inert environment and with different subjects. And this is important because when you are with people, think of dancing. When you are dancing with a group of people, you are providing cues to each other as to how those affordances are changing in real time. So it's not the stone is sitting there and I just perceive the affordance of throwing the stone. Is that we are coupling our respective affordances being perceived in a way that is reciprocal. So we are closing the loop in between agents, and that adds a layer of complexity. That layer of complexity is what we find here in the Three Sisters, in maze, climbing beans, and squash. They are playing this game. This is their dance, both below and above ground. As they grow, they are perceiving those patterns of interaction in between them three, right? So all these couplings in between them, like squash and maze, maze and climbing bean and squash, all that's part of this dance that is taking place in real time, right? So that's basically the idea. Actually, you can check. This is funny. If you see them, the three together, maze, climbing bean, and squash, that's what they look from the top, okay? But when you look underground, this is how they are growing the root apparatus. So the root system grows in a very interesting way, which is not competing against each other. So one root apparatus will grow more secondary roots, it will grow wider, the other one will grow thinner but deeper, and they have different layers such that they combine synergistically and symbiotically with each other, not competing for resources, but helping each other in this society that they have found that is beneficial to them all, right? So that's something that you can only understand by watching movement in real time. So you've got to time-lapse it. You have to see how they grow. If they are growing away from each other, if they are trying to keep a space in between them, if they are competing or not for resources, how they are dealing, how they are negotiating their interactions to make the best out of them, right? Yeah. So, okay, now comes, I forgot if we are doing well in terms of time. I think we're...
It's good. Yeah, don't worry. Don't worry, we have time, yeah.
Yeah. So this is I wouldn't like to miss this point. This is the very important point about why movement matters. Look at the petals here. This is the way you see the petal, you human observer, with your human eye. So that's what you see. Oh, nice spots, the stamen, the pollen grain. Well, that's nice, but you are not what the flowering plant cares about. She doesn't care about you. You are not the pollinator, right? You are an external observer. You are not part of this meaningful interaction. So the type of affordances that are being perceived, we need to think who the subjects are, because remember, the scale of interaction matters. Is their hand pushing the door, not your hand? So if you look at the petals through ultraviolet light, which is the way a pollinator would do, an insect would do, this is what the petals would look like. So these lines that you are missing, you don't see them, is what the insect is seeing. And this is what the whole flower looks like. So the flower looks like this, right? And you know what this is like? This is like this. This is the landmarks for the pollinator. So the flower is providing the landmarks, is helping the pollinator land onto the petals and take off with the valuable pollen load, right? See what I mean? Now, why we need to put arrows here? because these arrows is a reminder that information cannot be static. This, if you have a picture of a landing place, that's not helping you land. You need to see how it changes as you move towards the landing place. So you need to keep trying to land and see how it changes. That's the optic flow. That's the arrows. So you need to see how the image is expanding on your retina. As the image is expanding on your retina, if this moves to the periphery and you keep on sharp focus this point, then you are on target. Then you are landing safe. Bad news if the arrows move this other way, right? And you are gonna land here. You could see the optic flow going the wrong way, but you can turn direction. You can make adjustments because this is online interactions. Remember, this is the coupling. Again, think of the couple of dancers. When they are dancing with each other, they need to perceive the possibility of interaction and make adjustments on the fly in real time. So it's not that I compute the trajectory. Remember when we were talking about the climbing being on the target, it's not me computing the trajectory and then saying, okay, I'm gonna get there. No, it's simply keep moving, keep interacting, and see how things change as a result of the way I'm moving. That's what's meaningful. That's what's informative. So how the image expands or contracts or goes to the periphery or stays in the center as I move with respect to the target. So these lines are providing the landmarks that allow the pollinator to stay on track, right? One point is that we need to make that effort. And here part of the effort was to think, hey, it's not my eyes what matter, it's the eyes of the pollinator. Oh, let's see what the petals look like under UV light. Oh, under UV light, this is a beautiful landing aid, right? So now what's missing here? There is still one piece missing, which is that we are putting the emphasis on the pollinator and not on the flower. So it's like we are ascribing intelligence to the pollinator. It's like if the flower was simply, oh, evolution gave me this beautiful adaptation. I'm going to provide these UV lines that under UV light, the pollinator will see. But it's like as if the pollinator was the guy running the show. I'm just the landing platform and the pollinator is the guy doing the landing. But it's important to realize that this is a pattern of coevolution. So coevolution, two guys, the plant and the pollinator. So if they've reached this amazing, or they've co-evolved this set of adaptations that is clearly beneficial to the two of them, to both of them, then we need to think hard of how to apply the same type of ecological principles related to movement and not to representations and computations in the head of the plant to the plant and not just to the pollinator. So the idea is that it's not just the pollinator exploiting that information, the plant is exploiting that information. So this is what a fly would be seeing, right? As the fly is walking or is flying in this tunnel, this is the type of optic flow is being generated, right? And clearly what's happening is that it can turn, steer back to keep on course by connecting two nerves. In the case of the fly, is connecting these two nerves, and that connection is directly allowing for the reshaping of the flow, right? And change gear as needed. So on the fly, right? For the fly, on the fly, right? That happens again when you think of human subjects. So think of, this is a classical case of one of the fathers of these principles that we are skipping the technical details, but a picture is useful here. So this is a swinging or a hanging room. So it's a room where the walls are not onto the floor, but hanging from the ceiling. So you can move the walls, right? So this is a structure where the walls can be moved with this handle. So you can push the handle and the walls will move back and forward, right? So now check what happens when you put a baby in this room. Now, you see? Now the guy is gonna pull the walls towards the baby, away from the baby, it moves forward, now towards the baby, and the baby will fall. You see, look. Now the walls will come closer. You see? Now, what's happening here? Just think what's happening here. It's by changing the very environment, we are altering the optic flow. So even if the baby, the infant, is not walking, even if it's standing still, by changing the environment, we are generating the flow. So the rate, the changes in the size of the image in the retina. So this is like a gamer. Think of video gamers. I mean, kids playing video games. They happens the same to them. They are sitting on their seat, gaming, and then something is happening on the screen that is altering. They have the feeling that they are gonna impact. So they're gonna crash against the wall because the walls gets bigger, and then boom, and then it says game over, right? So why this is important? Because movement doesn't even relate to the organism. The gamer is sitting, the infant is sitting. Movement relates to the organism environment unit as such. Sometimes it's the environment the one that moves. Sometimes it's the organism, and sometimes it's both. So what really matters here is that there is a change in the types of energy flows that becomes meaningful with respect to the way organism and environment are interacting with each other. Remember, the environment can be a social environment. It doesn't need to be inert. It could be me sitting at the center and other guys dancing around me. It can be me dancing too. It can be both of us. It could be all of us being still and something inert playing the game. So energy flows. We need to see how they relate to each other as we close this loop of acting and perceiving in real time with respect to each other, right? Now it makes different sense. Now we cannot simply say, remember the first quote, hey, plants can afford to be stupid, they are rooted, because even if they are rooted, it's not just that we can appreciate how they grow and develop with time lapse. It's that we need to bring into the equation the very way the environment impinges upon the organism, even if it's sitting like a rooted plant or a video gamer, right? It's those flows what matters, right? Okay, so this is the example we can use from plants. Take one, well, of course, when we were talking about the climbing beam perceiving the pole, that's what we mean, right? That's clear. But think that any piece of information, so if we didn't take a picture of the stone that the mouse, the cat, and the human subject were perceiving, we said it's not the stone in itself, right? So you don't take into your brain a representation of the stone. Another way to put it is that what really counts, what matters, is never absolute values. So it's not the value of something in itself. It's always relational information. It's always one thing with respect to another. The hand with respect to the handle. The mouse with respect to the stone. The climbing beam with respect to the pole. So if it's always relational information, think how ecological this setting is when you apply the same principles to the plant itself. So don't think of the pollinator, think of the plant. Now, if you think of a plant, what happens to plants is that of all the wavelengths, they absorb some of them, they don't absorb the others. So they would be absorbing the blue and the red, and they could be letting the green and the far red go through, right? So different parts of the wavelength spectrum, they have different levels of energy, and plants will pick some energy and some other will not be useful for photosynthesis, right? So we have parts of the spectrum which are photosynthetically active and some parts which are photosynthetically inactive, right? So they absorb blue and red, they let green and far red go through, right? Skipping details, right? But just take red and far red. if red and far red are being this one is being absorbed and this one is not, you can talk about not the stone. You can talk about the relative value, so the ratio. You can talk about the ratio of red to far red light. So what's informative is not how much red light you have, but how much red light with respect to far red light. So if the ratio, if the relation of red to far red drops dramatically, that means that you are being shaded because this one is being absorbed by other guys in the vicinity, right? So by seeing how it drops, you can tell, if you're a plant, you can tell, hey, there is competition for sunlight around. I'd better move somewhere else. I'd better grow in some other direction, right? So high ratio, I'm doing good. I can just grow upwards. Low ratio, oh, I have these other guys around. I better move away and try to find my little, dose of sunflakes, or to bask in the sun by myself, away from all this competition, right? And that triggers shade avoidance responses. So you go away from shade, but you need to tell it, right? So what's important about this is that you are only, if it's relational, we need to understand it in terms of movement. Otherwise, it makes no sense. So it's not, what do you mean by having a low or a high ratio? It means with respect to where you were before. So you need to keep moving. Hey, as I'm moving, it's getting, like the kids playing these games of cold, cold, hot, hot, right? So you are not finding the treasure. Oh, it's cold, cold, cold. You go somewhere else. Okay, it's getting hotter, getting hotter. You're burning yourself. I got it. Okay, so that sort of game. So that's what they are playing. I'm moving. Oh, the ratio is lowering. It's dropping. Plenty of people around. I'll turn. Oh, the ratio is going up. Okay, away from the shade, into the sun. That's what's happening. But you can only make sense of those ratios if they're going up or down by keeping in meaningful terms the type of interactions you are engaging in with your environment. I need to keep growing and see what happens. And to do that, you need to do three things, not just to perceive the surroundings. So that's called esteroception. So not to perceive the external world, but to perceive your inner side and to perceive your body posture. So you have to combine esteroception, interoception, and proprioception. And by combining those three, and if you have these other guys combining those three as well, if everybody else combine those three, then you are dancing with each other. Otherwise, we are isolated in our compartments, right? So let me just, let's wrap up and close, because I guess this is starting to be a little bit too long. But one of the things, let's talk about this enaction of the bridge in between the plant sciences and the arts, right? So let's sort of zoom back and see where we are. To me, what's truly important is not that we find evidence which is confirmatory or falsifies our hypothesis. I said before that we don't know if plants learn by association because we are trying to replicate it and we haven't done it yet. So we will see. The same goes for climbing towards a pole, everything. So this is science, right? And it means we need to be very careful and play the game with the rules of the game. Now, with that being said, a wrong way to play the game of doing science is not to ask questions or not to think different, because it's something that orthodox or mainstream ways of thinking don't allow. So it doesn't matter whether your ideas are crazy, bizarre, or nobody else follows them. What matters is that you are able to generate predictions and to make them testable. So that's what truly matters. And if we are able to think different at all, that has to do, not just one of my obsessions has to do with education prior to university. I mean, secondary school kids, like how we are able to allow them to provide the means for them to truly think different, right? and truly think different is to, this is an example, plant intelligence. It's not pseudoscience, it's not we are talking voodoo science. No, it's plant science. It's simply questioning the establishment. It's simply questioning the orthodox mainstream attitude. And that's what Darwin was doing over 100 years ago. People just didn't get it. So a lot of work is still pending, and we just need to be critical enough and exploit enough imagination to think differently. So one way to put it is, I love this couple of lines from Sidney Brenner's autobiography, My Life in Science. He in the 60s and 70s, he was one of the main characters in one revolution in molecular biology. It was the generation immediately after Watson and Crick discovered the double helix. And they were doing all these things at the time in Cavendish lab in Cambridge. And one thing that I found really inspiring in his autobiography is when he talks about the power of ignorance. The power of ignorance has to do with not knowing your stuff. Of course, you've got to know your stuff. It has to do with being able to raise the type of questions that you can only raise from a foreign point of view. And that's where arts come into place, for example. If you are able to entertain theoretical hypotheses or think of commitments, theoretical commitments, other than those that the guys in the field are able to use, think of the very notion of intelligence when we relate it to representations and computations, or to the computer metaphor. Intelligence is whatever the mind is doing, which is like the software floating on my hardware, which is the neuronal tissue. Well, we've rehearsed that line for so long that we forget that there are alternatives. And sometimes those alternatives, we only let them flourish when somebody else from the outside, the outsider, has the power to tell those, to raise those questions. That's the power of ignorance, right? And another way he puts it is that knowing too much curtails creativity. And in a sense, it's true that sometimes you can get so much into the fine-grained detail of a working hypothesis that you lost track of the forest. You're so close to that single tree that you are just tree-hugging the tree of your working hypothesis, and you aren't able at all to see beyond, right? So when I think of this way of enacting the bridge in between the plant sciences and the arts, and with we philosophers and cognitive scientists in the middle, I take it, is by in between us all being able to think different and inform each other's as to way to reciprocally enact those patterns of thought, right? And I guess that's it.
That's very nice. Yeah.
Let me just shut the record.